Sophie stood by the window, gazing out into the backyard where her husband, David, was meticulously mowing the lawn. It was one of the rare sunny days in early spring, and everything seemed to be in its rightful place. The house was perfect. White picket fence, blooming flowers, and the sound of birds chirping as David worked. Inside, the scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, giving their home a warm and inviting atmosphere. She gently placed her hand on her rounded belly, feeling the slight flutter of movement from the life growing inside her. Their baby. She smiled to herself. This was the life she had always dreamed of. Married to a good man, expecting her first child, and surrounded by the safety and security of domestic bliss. Sophie had known David for nearly a decade. They met in college, and he had been her rock ever since. Dependable, honest, kind. He loved her deeply, and she loved him too. At least, she thought she did. But recently, that love had started to feel like something different. Something more like routine, an obligation, even a duty. The excitement they once shared had slowly been replaced by discussions of baby names, nursery decorations, and monthly savings. It was all practical. Necessary, yes, but practical and empty. Sophie sighed, brushing a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear. Maybe it was just the hormones. Pregnancy could do strange things to a woman, she reminded herself. The doubts, the fleeting moments of restlessness, they would pass. It was normal. David waved at her through the window, his smile wide and proud. She waved back, forcing a grin. As he turned to finish his work, she leaned against the wall, feeling a pang of guilt. David was a good man, a wonderful husband, and a soon-to-be father. Why wasn't that enough? That question had plagued her for weeks now, ever since Jake came back into their lives. Jake, David's younger brother, had always been a wild card. He was the complete opposite of David in almost every way. Where David was steady and focused, Jake was unpredictable, living life on the edge. He'd spent the last few years traveling the world, working odd jobs, and chasing the next thrill. Sophie had always admired his free spirit, the way he embraced life without hesitation. But when he came to visit after returning from his most recent trip, something had shifted between them. At first it was subtle. Sophie had always been fond of Jake, and their conversations were easy, natural. But as days turned into weeks, their interactions became more charged. A lingering glance here, a playful touch there. His deep blue eyes had a way of locking on to hers, making her feel seen in a way that David no longer did. Jake was dangerous in all the ways that tempted her, and the worst part? He knew it too. It was late afternoon when Sophie heard the familiar roar of Jake's motorcycle pulling into the driveway. Her heart skipped a beat. David was still out back, and she wasn't expecting Jake to stop by. Not today. She quickly wiped her hands on a dish towel and headed to the front door, feeling her pulse quicken as she opened it. Jake stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe, his trademark grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Hey, Soph," he greeted, his voice warm and teasing. "Thought I'd stop by and see my favorite sister-in-law. How's the baby doing?" Sophie smiled, but there was a tension in the air that neither of them could ignore. "She's fine," Sophie replied, resting her hand on her belly again. "Still kicking." Jake's eyes flickered to her hand, and for a moment, something passed between them. Something dangerous. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The silence was thick, the air charged with unspoken words. "You look good, you know," Jake said, his voice low as he moved closer to her. "Pregnancy suits you." Sophie's heart raced as she took a small step back, but she couldn't deny the way her body reacted to his proximity. She had been craving attention, affection, and Jake had always been a master at giving her exactly what she wanted. "Jake," she began, but her voice trailed off. She didn't know what to say. What could she say? "I'm just being honest," he replied, his eyes locking onto hers. "I know David's a lucky guy. You two are perfect together, but—" He hesitated, his gaze darkening. "There's always been something between us, hasn't there?" Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never said it out loud, never even fully admitted it to herself, but there was no denying it anymore. From the first time she met Jake, there had been a spark, a connection, one she had buried deep, refusing to acknowledge it for the sake of her relationship with David. But now, with the distance growing between her and her husband, that spark had reignited, burning hotter than ever. "Jake, we can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake moved closer, his hand brushing against hers. "Why not? David doesn't have to know. It's just us. No one else." The rational part of Sophie's mind screamed for her to push him away, to tell him to leave and never come back. But there was another part of her, a darker, more reckless side that had been suppressed for too long, and that side wanted Jake. Before she could stop herself, she leaned in, their lips barely inches apart. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only them, standing on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from destroying everything. But in that instant, she didn't care. Jake closed the distance, his lips pressing against hers in a hungry, desperate kiss. Sophie's mind screamed at her to stop, but her body responded instinctively, giving in to the surge of passion that had been building between them for weeks. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. And for the first time in months, she felt alive. She wasn't thinking about David, or the baby, or the consequences of what she was doing. In that moment, all that mattered was Jake. His touch, his warmth, the way he made her feel wanted. They stumbled backward, their kiss growing more urgent as they moved toward the couch. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled Jake down with her, their bodies pressing together as they gave in to the overwhelming desire that had consumed them both. For a brief, intoxicating moment, Sophie allowed herself to forget everything else. She forgot about her husband, the life they had built together, the child she was carrying. All that mattered was the thrill of being with Jake, the forbidden passion that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. But as they lay there, tangled together, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. Sophie pulled away from Jake, her breath ragged as she sat up. The room was spinning, her mind racing with guilt and confusion. What had she done? How could she have let it go this far? Jake reached out, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Sophie, I can't do this," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. This isn't right." Jake's expression softened, but he didn't push her. He knew what they had done was wrong, but he wasn't sorry. He had wanted her for so long, and now that he'd had a taste, he didn't want to let her go. "We don't have to tell anyone," he said quietly. "It doesn't have to mean anything." But Sophie shook her head, her stomach twisting with shame. "It means everything. I'm pregnant with David's baby, Jake. I can't do this." She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself as the weight of her betrayal crushed down on her. She loved David, at least she thought she did. But now, after what she had just done, she wasn't sure of anything anymore. "I need you to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, Jake, just go." Jake hesitated, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he stood up. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her to change her mind. He simply nodded and left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Sophie stood there, her heart pounding in her chest as the silence of the empty house closed in around her. She had made a terrible mistake, one that could shatter everything she had worked so hard to build with David. As the weight of her actions settled over her, Sophie sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She was trapped between two brothers, one who loved her unconditionally and the other who had awakened something inside her she couldn't control. And now, no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The following days passed in a blur of guilt, anxiety, and shame. Sophie barely slept. tossing and turning in the bed she shared with David, her mind replaying her betrayal over and over again. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's face, felt the heat of his touch, and heard the echo of her own desires. She wanted to convince herself that it was just a moment of weakness, that she could put it behind her and pretend it never happened. But the memory of it clung to her, heavy and suffocating. David, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her, continued with his routine, working long hours to prepare for the arrival of their baby, doting on her whenever he could, and asking about her day with genuine affection. His love for her was unwavering, and it only made Sophie feel worse. How could she have betrayed someone so devoted? Every kind gesture from him was a reminder of her guilt, and she found it harder and harder to meet his eyes. Jake, to his credit, kept his distance after that day. He hadn't called, hadn't shown up unannounced, and Sophie was grateful for that. She didn't trust herself around him, didn't trust that she wouldn't fall into his arms again. But the more time passed, the more the silence between them gnawed at her. The intensity of their brief encounter lingered, leaving a hollow ache inside her that she couldn't shake. One afternoon, as Sophie sat on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the lawn, she heard the familiar rumble of Jake's motorcycle approaching the house. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't ready to see him, but she knew this moment was inevitable. Jake parked his bike at the end of the driveway and walked toward her, his expression unreadable. Sophie stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She hadn't planned on speaking to him again, hadn't even thought of what she'd say if he showed up. But now that he was here, she couldn't avoid it. "I didn't think you'd come back," Sophie said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shrugged, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he stopped a few feet away from her. "I didn't plan to, but I couldn't stay away." Sophie's chest tightened. There was a part of her that had wanted him to stay away, to make things easier. But another part, the part that had given in to him so easily, was relieved to see him. His presence made her feel alive again, in a way that her life with David hadn't in a long time. "You shouldn't be here, Jake," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I know," he replied, his gaze intense. "But I had to see you. We need to talk about what happened." Sophie shook her head, her hands trembling as she wrapped her arms around herself. "No, we don't. It was a mistake, a huge mistake. I love David and I'm pregnant with his child. What we did, it can't happen again." Jake stepped closer, his expression softening. "Sophie, I know it's complicated. I know you're scared, but don't pretend that there isn't something between us. I felt it. You felt it. This wasn't just some random fling." "Jake, stop!" she pleaded, her voice shaky. "Please, I can't do this." But Jake wouldn't relent. "Sophie, you deserve to be happy. I've watched you with David. He's a good guy, but he doesn't see you anymore. He's more focused on work, on the baby. You're just there. But you're more than that, and you know it." Sophie's heart twisted painfully. Everything Jake said was true, and that made it worse. She did feel invisible in her own life, trapped in the perfect picture of what a marriage and family should look like. But she had chosen this life. She had chosen David, and she had chosen to build a future with him. "I made a commitment," Sophie said firmly, though her voice wavered. "I can't just throw that away." Jake reached out, gently taking her hand. "I'm not asking you to throw anything away. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself. What do you really want?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What did she want? Sophie had spent so long doing what she thought she was supposed to do, marrying the right man, building the perfect home, preparing for the baby. But when she looked deep inside, she wasn't sure if any of it truly made her happy anymore. Not in the ways she had once imagined. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pulled her hand away from Jake's. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Jake took a step back, his eyes softening as he watched her struggle with the weight of her emotions. He didn't push her any further, didn't try to convince her. Instead, he nodded, understanding that this was something she had to figure out on her own. "I won't pressure you, Sophie," he said gently, "but I'm here if you need me." With that, Jake turned and walked away, leaving Sophie standing on the porch, torn between the life she had built and the dangerous allure of what could be. The following weeks were agonizing for Sophie. Every time she looked at David, she felt the weight of her betrayal crushing her. He was oblivious, still completely in the dark about what had happened between her and Jake. His love for her remained steadfast, and as the weeks passed, he grew more excited about the baby, spending hours planning the nursery and talking about their future as a family. Sophie tried to push Jake out of her mind, but she couldn't. His words haunted her, echoing in her head as she struggled to navigate her feelings. She knew what she had with David was stable, secure, and safe. But with Jake, she had felt something wild and electric, a passion she hadn't realized she was missing. As her due date approached, Sophie became more and more anxious. She couldn't bring a child into the world with this secret hanging over her. She couldn't live with the guilt anymore, couldn't pretend that everything was fine when her heart was in turmoil. One evening, after David had gone to bed, Sophie sat in the nursery, staring at the crib they had assembled together. The tiny clothes hung in the closet, and the soft blankets were folded neatly in the dresser. Everything was ready for their baby. Everything except Sophie. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, after David left for work, Sophie called Jake. Her heart raced as she waited for him to pick up, her hands trembling as she gripped the phone. When his voice came through the line, she felt a strange mix of relief and dread. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice tight with emotion. Jake arrived within the hour, and they sat together on the porch, the tension between them palpable. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind 1,000 times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt heavy on her tongue. "I can't do this anymore, Jake," she said finally. "I can't live with the guilt. I love David. He's been nothing but good to me, and I've betrayed him in the worst way." Jake's expression was unreadable, but he didn't interrupt her. "I'm not saying that what I felt for you wasn't real," Sophie continued, her voice cracking. "It was, but I can't be with you. I can't throw away my marriage, my family, for something that was a mistake." Jake's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his eyes betraying the hurt he was trying to hide. "I understand," he said quietly. "I just want you to be happy, Sophie." "I need to try and make things right with David," Sophie said, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "I need to be honest with him." Jake stared at her for a moment, then stood up, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and acceptance. "I'll always be here for you, Sophie, no matter what." As Jake walked away for the last time, Sophie knew that the hardest part was still ahead. That evening, when David returned home, Sophie sat him down in the living room. Her heart pounded as she looked into his kind eyes, knowing that what she was about to say would shatter him. But she couldn't live with the lie anymore. She had to come clean. "David," she began, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." His smile faltered, concern filling his eyes. "What is it, Soph?" Sophie took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. "I've made a terrible mistake." And with that, the truth came tumbling out, about her and Jake, about the affair, and about the guilt that had been eating away at her for weeks. David's face went pale, his expression one of disbelief and heartbreak. The silence between them stretched on, thick and unbearable. I don't even know what to say," David finally whispered, his voice hollow. "I'm so sorry, David," Sophie sobbed. "I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. I made a terrible mistake." David stood up, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. "I need time," he said, his voice tight. "I need to think." Without another word, he walked out the door, leaving Sophie alone in the living room. Her heart shattered. It took months for Sophie and David to find their way back to each other, and even then, things were never quite the same. Trust had been broken, and though David eventually forgave her, the shadow of her betrayal lingered over their marriage. Sophie knew that she had come close to losing everything, but in the end, she had made a choice to fight for the life she had built, the family she had promised to protect. And while the road ahead was uncertain, she had no regrets about the decision she had made. Sometimes, love wasn't about passion or excitement. Sometimes, it was about forgiveness, redemption, and the quiet strength it took to rebuild something that had been broken. And that was the life Sophie chose.